Hello and welcome back to the HG Rugby podcast. My name is Hugh, and on this week's episode, we will be talking about the Rugby Championship. We'll be taking an analytical look back at how the Springboks, the All Blacks, Argentina, and the Wallabies have been getting on. We'll then have a special deep dive into the Wallabies and everything Australia rugby to understand, is it really as bad as people say, or is there hope on the horizon? I'm not alone. I'm joined by Brendon Shields, who is from Rugbycology, which is a rugby analytics company. Brendon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Hugh. Real appreciate it. Nice to be here.
So, where are you joining us from, Brendon? People may detect from your accent, you are joining us from the great country of Australia. Whereabouts?
Yeah. Look, I'm actually born and bred in Bethlehem, which is a really small town in the middle of the Free State in South Africa. We emigrated to Australia about 6 years ago now, where we live in Brisbane. Lovely city, really good place to be. It's the best time of the year. It's not so bloody hot yet, which is why I'm sitting outside, and it is almost 7 o'clock in Brisbane. So if I'm having a beer already, don't judge.
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right, let's dive head first into it then. The Rugby Championship finished a week ago as time of recording. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think it all transpired as expected. I think everyone was surprised a bit by Argentina's performance, but we've been tracking that for the last 3 years. They would have really good wins against New Zealand, get a bit of a hiding in the second test, and the same applied then for all their games. First up, beating South Africa, losing badly in the second. First up, losing to Aussie, and then trashing Aussie in the second test. So I think Argentina is the most interesting of the four because they don't have as much resources, have to pull in players from all over the world for short campaigns before they meet, but seem to have a lot of cohesion, even moving from Checo's days now. So I think there's been a lot of proper planning around the Jaguares at first and how that
Yeah.
infiltrated into Super Rugby and essentially a really cohesive system going into the international setup. I'm not quite privy to how influential the sevens program is on their 15s program in general from a strength and conditioning point of view. But definitely we could see Argentina play a style that avoided rucks, um, didn't put up rucks unnecessarily, stayed in contact that 1 or 2 seconds longer, got a lot of offloads away. So in open play, it looked like they were playing sevens a bit, which is incredibly exciting because their sevens for a decade now has been really competitive. At times last year, they looked unplayable. I think they fell away a little bit towards the end, but the two interesting things for me in world rugby is how Argentina have developed their sevens program and is bringing that into their game. And on the other side of that coin, how Fiji is moving slightly away from sevens, but becoming really adept at playing 15-man rugby with incredibly solid set pieces, really strong scrum, really strong lineouts, strong defensive basics. So I'd like to have a look at those two teams over, say, a 5-year period
Hmm.
from say 2 years ago and see over the next 3 years where they go because it's incredibly healthy for the game. But yeah, I think then we're looking at the problem child. Aussie at the moment, obviously struggling. Her new coach in Joe Schmidt, who coincidentally is really good at the thing Australian rugby struggles the most at, which is ruck play.
Hmm.
For those of your listeners who are not as familiar with the influence of rugby league. I mean, obviously we have that in the UK as well, but maybe not as influential as the NRL is here. Your average rugby playing kid would be consuming rugby league throughout the week on a much more regular basis than they would be consuming or watching rugby union. And if you go to say the bedroom wall of a young kid in Australia at the moment, likelihood there's going to be a Fraser McRide on there, but 8 or 9 posters from rugby league players. And I think over the years, what what crept into the Australian game a little bit is, number one, an over-reliance on that ball in hand thing, because it's something you see on a league pitch, and a lot of players play union and league at the same time. And then also the ruck play becoming incredibly inaccurate and poor, because in league there are no rucks.
Yeah.
So the biggest difference between the two sports is that incredibly important area for rugby union, which league coaches, league players don't even bother with. So, I'm fortunate to be involved in quite a lot of levels at the game, from really young to schools and clubs, and then all the way up. And you can see how a deep culture is formed around certain aspects of play, and all countries have that. But in Aussie, because ruck play is so, let's say, abandoned, it has become a real problem. I've been measuring since the Dave Rennie days, the Wallabies, in quite detail, and it's always been the biggest weakness. Far too high a risk factor, because just do not know when to surrender ball, do not know when to kick, and is really poor technique-wise at the ruck. So losing a lot of ball, losing a lot of momentum, and just never really getting going. And it's because of that deep culture being a bit of an issue. Talk about deep culture then. We go to the Springboks. Fascinating story of how they changed this year. We could see it from the end of last year already.
Yeah, absolutely.
Analytically, just the numbers suddenly looked totally different. You almost couldn't recognize that as a Springbok team. I remember measuring a game 2 or so years ago where they made 78 passes all game, and they
Yeah.
made 49 kicks.
And now they're making
All of
like
a sudden,
180.
yeah, now they're clocking close to 200, and
But
then, really starting to use the ball.
they're still quite heavy. So I did a calculation of passes per ruck and kicks per ruck
Yeah,
and things, and the Springboks still have the fewest passes per ruck in the Rugby Championship. So the All Blacks were at 1.94, which is
yeah,
really a lot higher than everybody else. And we'll talk a bit more about the All Blacks in a minute. But the Springboks,
yeah,
1.6 passes per ruck, and they had the most rucks, or second most rucks after Australia, ironically, of
yeah.
anyone in the Rugby Championship. But their ruck speed was they had the highest proportion or highest number of rucks below 3 seconds. Is are they? Is it becoming a bit, because the change for the Springboks was so vivid of what they were doing before to what they're doing now? People are kind of overstating how razzle dazzle they are, shall we say, or are they're still quite within their DNA for me, I think. And a lot of people are talking about South Africa DNA, and every time they move away from their DNA, it always goes wrong and they always end up coming back in again. For you, from your point of view, what's the big numbers we've talked about the passing. What's the big numbers that's like, wow, that's the big change for the Springboks now?
Yeah, look, I mean, if I just have a browse through here, a summary of the Rugby Championship, the Springboks outside of penalties still kicked 53%. The closest to that would be
Mm.
All Blacks at 49, Wallabies and Argentina on 43. And then you look at the percentage of play where they do not kick at all. Everyone is in the 34 percentiles, and the Springboks on 27. So they still, like you say, absolutely right. It's not as if they've become a circus act. They're not just flinging the ball willy-nilly and playing kind of seven style. I think we're all just really accustomed to a box kick and the setup for a box kick, and everything the Springboks do being aimed at slowing things down, controlling tempo, controlling metric. I think the most interesting study about them, and that's going to be an ongoing thing, the minute they started flinging ball around, I thought, all right, their risk factor is going to go up now. And
Mm.
um, I look at risk simply as how you lose possession. Do you lose it in dodgy areas, and do you lose it to penalties and turnovers, as opposed to normal areas that lead to opponent scrums? And teams who, I mean, obviously, if you put up more rucks, if you pass the ball more, there's going to be more risk invited into your game. So really interesting to see where the Springboks land at the moment. But currently, they are still very safe. Um, I cannot reasonably see that continue. I think there's going to be analysis done on how they attack, certain cues on when they will play wide. And all of a sudden, I think there's going to be a risk. In the Rugby Championship, the first game here in Brisbane, the second half, the Wallabies were quite strong and came back into the game after being whitewashed in the first half. But really interesting to see how the Springboks had to go back to scoring tries purely off mauls.
Yes.
There were no other ways through. Luckily, there's enough, let's say, memory in the Springbok DNA of how to be really good at that. But make no mistake, as they move further away from those core competencies and those things that made them such a, impenetrable rugby team, there's going to be more risk invited, and I think we can expect to see the Springboks maybe copying a loss here and there. Obviously, they approach World Cup cycles a little bit differently, so it's going to be interesting to see where they land in 2027 if they at some stage pull things back a little bit. But I just think the type of player that they now select is very different to the type of player, let's say, traditional Springbok rugby was built around, and that is exciting. Is it a horse that you can rein in and control? They're definitely doing that at the moment. Is it going to last? That's for me the interesting question to answer.
Yeah, they've got a very different group of talent coming through. I've been speaking about this with other people, and if you look at people like Sasha Feinberg and Gomezulu, if you look at the type of players they have playing for the franchises in the URC at the moment, it is a lot more exciting players, particularly in the backs. And if you look at the style of rugby that the Bulls and the Lions are playing in particular, it's very high try scoring, high running, like striking from far out type rugby. But to your point about the risk factor, so I've got up on the screen a look at their execution, and the Springboks probably make the most mistakes out of the Rugby Championship sides. If you look at the spread of what they do, the All Blacks actually make quite a reasonably small amount of mistakes in terms of the absolute numbers. But I think it's because of they've got the physical and the fitness strength over the other teams, and also I think field position as well. The Springboks dominate field position in games that they play. So I think that allows them to take the more risks. And so they do, lose a high number of turnovers. They do make a few mistakes. They do take, as you said, a lot of risks, but they're getting away with it at the moment. But getting away with it is the wrong words. They are enabling themselves to do that by playing in the right areas.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I looked at it now. If you were to assign a value or create a metric around the quality of the platform you attack from, you can have a look at, for example, if you attack off a turnover in your own 22, it's not as good a platform as attacking off a turnover close to your opponent's try line. Similarly, attacking off a scrum in your own 22 is probably a very risky platform, whereas a scrum in zone 3 or way upfield is a fantastic platform to attack from. So we can assign a little bit of value to where play starts and how play starts. And from that point of view, the Springboks are just so smart, like just ridiculously smart. They create very, very good play platforms by how they attack. I think we've always looked at them as a defense-first team, and they are, let's say, relentless in physicality and all those kind of cliches. But I think it's always for them been around where do we play and where do we allow our opponent to play from. And looking at the data from my side now after the Rugby Championship, just the platform quality is a good 12-15% better than any of the other three teams. So that is an old school, let's say, Springbok philosophy where you play territory first. You have a 10 who's a general. You have a 9 who, would not take too many chances. We can expect those things probably to dwindle a little bit over time, because I I cannot see a Libbok or these guys, first and foremost, go onto the field to manage territory. Whereas a guy like Pollard, it would have been how he was brought up since he was 6 years old. The number 10 is the general. You override all play because this is the most important thing. Looking at how we approach things in Aussie, it's very different. You want your 10 to be kind of fleet-footed, someone who can attack the line, someone who really plays on top of the defense, someone who has a good pass but a good vision to run lines, all the stuff that you'd associate with a Larkham, or on the New Zealand side, maybe Carlos Spencer. That's the type of 10 that we want in Aussie, or that gets selected for junior teams. Whereas in South Africa, it would be, number one, can he kick the ball far? Number two, is he a general? Does he stand up and look at play? Can he keep his jersey clean, basically, and manage things? Very, very different philosophies. But when it comes to the risk that South Africa invites or doesn't invite into their game, I think the most important thing from an analytical point of view is going to be to see whether analysts are able to pick it off. We've already seen teams like New Zealand figure out the rush defense. South Africa themselves kicking an awful lot more to get around that rush defense. That coincidentally, I think, is something Scotland should be given credit for. Maybe not as big runners, but really smart rugby players. And through Finn Russell over the years, they were able to play that kicking game, a long passing game, to try and get around the defense, which I think teams are doing with South Africa now. I think my concern with that attack is, as soon as territory is not the be-all and end-all of why you attack and how you attack, I think, again, you invite a little bit of risk, and it's going to be really interesting to see end-of-the-year tour in adverse weather with the Northern Hemisphere gunning. It's going to be really interesting to see how the Southern Hemisphere teams adapt. I think Aussie with Joe Schmidt, who spent so much time up there, is probably going to be one of the safer teams.
I think so.
So, yeah, all to play for.
Yeah, so I just want to go touch back on Argentina for a second, because you mentioned the Jaguares link, and I did a bit of analysis on it, and I found that I think 12 out of the starting 15 strongest team for Argentina were all played together at Jaguares or came through that institution, if you like. So we talk about their players being scattered across the world. They still do have that link at the moment, and whether they'll continue to have that is interesting to see. There's rumours of Jaguares perhaps coming back to Super Rugby. We don't know, but the fascinating thing that you said that I really want to focus on is Argentina don't want rucks. So if I share the screen again and if I show you the data that I managed to collect, so you can see Argentina got the least rucks of anybody in the Rugby Championship, and the games that they played, if you look at the games that they won, very low ruck count comparatively. I think in the game that they won against the Springboks, they had 49 rucks in the whole game. That's like essentially no rucks. And the same against New Zealand. And the games that they won, they had the games that they lost, they had north of 90 rucks, which still isn't tons, but it's more than they would normally have. What do you think is behind that strategy for them?
I come back to, I think, the Leinster, let's say, model, and we can look at Joe Schmidt, who for a long time didn't allow Leinster and then subsequently Ireland to offload. And the thinking behind it was, if the ball carrier signals very clearly what's going to happen when he carries ball into contact, the supporting players know much better how to react. So if the ball carrier goes into contact with first kind of at number 99, seeing is he going to win the collision and maybe offload, or is he going to go to ground and present the ball clearly? If he goes into contact, not 100% sure, the supporting players, the players who have to clear, the players who have to run onto the ball are all slightly in doubt. Joe Schmidt said, let's remove that doubt. Yes, the offload is great. Yes, there's going to be times when the offload was the better option. But over a game of, say, 120, 130 rucks, if we have more certainty around what's going to happen, we will have better outcomes. And I think they've proven that to be right. Leinster was the first team who started running 24, 25, 28 phases.
Yeah.
I see Joe Schmidt's trying that with Australia now. To give you an idea, I think we were on 2.81 rucks per attack throughout the David Rennie years into Eddie Jones, and immediately lifted to 3.5 and are now close to 3.8. So he's definitely managed to add an extra ruck to play.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see the way, what he's trying to do. But what Argentina does, which is the opposite, and strangely enough, Contepomi was with Joe at
Yeah,
Leinster
that
and
is
other few
ironic, isn't
other
it?
players, yeah, but went a totally different way. But I think it is the same theory. But whereas Contepomi decided, let's give us certainty by knowing the ball carrier is always and try and offload versus always going to go to ground. It's essentially the same certainty that you bake into the support runners to say, right, we're not going to immediately land, go to ground and try and present. We will always try and stay up. So if you're going to come into support, let's create them all, let's move forward. Or I'm going to try and wriggle out and eventually offload, be ready for that ball to come your way. When they scored all those points against Aussie, when they came back against the Springboks, that's exactly what they did. The Springboks would be making a fairly good tackle, but the Argentinian just stands that extra second and a half in that contact and manages to free possession or
Absolutely.
manages to have a really dominant carry. And that's very hard to defend against if you then generate the quick ruck. So I love that. I'm just
Yeah, and I think we have to recognize the quality of player that Argentina have these days. If you look at someone like Choco Barras and Malia, play for Toulouse, arguably the highest level of club rugby in the world. You've got Cinti, who's plays for Saracens in England, who came from Sevens as well, and you got someone like Carreras on the wing, who even playing for Newcastle Falcons managed to look like an absolute world beater. And Albanoz as well, one of the most underrated players in the world, I think, for me. Just really high quality players. So I think they're playing to their strengths. One thing that I have noticed about them as well, which was kind of unusual, talk about the physicality. And we know they've got those two flankers in Kremer and Matera, who are just their absolute enforcers. They carry and smash everything. If you look at their top carriers, top tacklers, every game it's those two. But dominant hits. Now, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on dominant hits as a stat and kind of what's behind it. But Argentina by far the most, and against South Africa in the game that they won, Cinti at outside centre made 5 dominant tackles, which is so unusual. What do you think allows them to do that? And what do you think of that as a statistic generally?
Yeah, I'm a far bigger fan of a dominant tackle stat than I am, for example, of a collision one, because a collision you can very often see a player maybe gets through a collision, stretches an extra leg, then goes to ground, but because he's now overstretched, actually ends up losing the ball because his own player and support is not there.
Right.
So if you look at the outcomes of let's say winning collisions, I'm not always so sure. I'm not always so sure winning a collision per se is always a good thing. Like a kick is only as good as its chase. I think a collision
Absolutely.
is only as good as the support that's there, and sometimes going that extra little bit can get you in trouble if you go to ground. But it has to be a technique thing, and I think we have to go back to the sevens. Why do Argentina come from nowhere to suddenly really dominating? And I mean beating teams by 20, 30 points. Um, I think we can look back at the 2019 World Cup, South Africa being of just a level of conditioning that seemed to be a little bit out of kilter with the rest of everyone else. I think there's a lot to be said for the science and the development in strength and conditioning. There's people trying new things. There's new diets. There's new approaches to sleep. And let's say all professional outfits are into it. But I don't think there's a lot of uniformity. I don't think the top teams share what they do. Let's say Saracens a few years ago would have been dominant for a few reasons, but make no mistake that they were conditioned to last a very long season. They were conditioned to play in two different competitions and dominate both. Um, Maybe you could say the same thing for Leinster and ask questions around why they fall short towards the end. But I think with Argentina, we're going to look at two things. You'll look at strength and conditioning. They don't seem to be carrying any weight. They all seem to be incredibly fit, very well conditioned. And I think, secondly, would be technique. I always like to look at that deep culture aspect of how countries approach sport. So Australia has a very different approach to how they coach everything, from swimming to cricket to rugby to Argentina would have always been known in soccer terms as an incredibly technically astute nation when it comes to technique and how they train. In rugby, maybe comparable to New Zealand, and how the Kiwis just always trained in that way that was a little bit more technical, sweating the small stuff, being into detail. I think what the Kiwis made a mistake is they exported all their coaches around the world.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden everyone was into that detail. But for me, looking at a dominant hit and looking at a stat like what you've just mentioned would suggest, yes, all players are into it. All players are dedicated. All players are committed. But there's, for me, a conditioning and a technique issue that probably yields those outcomes.
Okay, that's really fascinating. It's a great point. No, it's one of those things that I didn't notice until you said it, and now you said it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, you're right. The Argentinians are quite a slimmed down team. They're not massive hulks. If you look at the front row selections that they're making, perhaps not the best scrummagers, but obviously a lot more mobile. Let's talk about New
Yeah.
Zealand now. So, first Rugby Championship under Razor, 3 from 6 is not a record we're used to seeing from the Kiwis. They had the disruption in the middle with Lane McDonald leaving and Razor now taking over being the attacks coach. For me, when I watched New Zealand and I looked back on the stats of the games, particularly the games that they lost, I felt overplaying. Overplaying. It felt like every carry had to be a line break. Everything that Damien McKenzie felt they had to do needed to be a miracle. And if you look at the tries that they scored, most of them were off transition or off first phase. They weren't doing what South Africa were doing, which is going through multiple phases. Again, like what I think Schmidt is trying to do and what Ireland do very well of breaking you down gradually. The All Blacks didn't seem capable of maintaining long phases of attack, and yeah, just completely trying to make miracles happen all the time. What was your view on how they played in this Rugby Championship?
Yeah, it's hard to criticize. I think, we expect the standard from New Zealand, and I think what a lot of people, maybe it's not so much in sight, is New Zealand for a very long time managed to retain pretty much 100% of their players in country. Then you had Sepuaga go. I think he was the first one. And now, all of a sudden, you do have a lot of talent leaving New Zealand quite early. So that's a reality that, you look at South Africa, for example, there was a time when they couldn't buy a win. But one of the key things that Rassie insisted on taking the job was to be able to select whomever he wants. The guy before him, who had a 38 or 35% win rate, did not have that luxury of doing that. But the minute they started leaking young talent, a powerhouse like South Africa couldn't buy a win.
Yeah.
New
If you look
Zealand
at
maybe managed
Colby,
it
for example, Colby, for example, didn't get picked until he was at Toulouse.
Yeah. I think New Zealand will, over time, get used to that. They will manage players a bit better. I think maybe the South African model has shown the other Southern Hemisphere teams that you can't be precious over everyone. So if you have, say, a rock star tight head prop, send him to Europe for 4 years. The risk is just residency and players leaving too early and then being offered opportunities by the country up north, and then that's a gamble you're always going to have to play. But you can't afford, number one, all the talent in a country like New Zealand, and number two, you're going to lose young talent, and you need to learn how to pick All Black sides essentially that no longer has a spine of X amount of tests, and it's going to affect everyone. And in the days of analysis and of coaching methods and strength and conditioning, teams are coming closer and closer to one another. We've seen that with Georgia We've seen that with Portugal. I mean, Portugal, it's just scary how technically proficient they are. It's scary the type of skill set they have, how fit they are for a country that hardly plays any rugby ever against any notable opposition. So that's just science. In New Zealand, we live in a different world now where they also just one of the other guys. But why I wouldn't knock them and why I wouldn't criticize how they played, maybe overplaying, is I think they are tapping into what their core strength have always been, which is innovation and which is element of surprise and which is having a real crack. They're not known to be conservative. So I lived in a South Africa where we always try to follow what New Zealand was doing, always try to follow what the Aussies were doing on attack, never looking at, but what makes you strong? What is the thing that makes you unbeatable if you get it right or if you focus on only that thing? Now we're almost at a position where New Zealand are starting to really lament South Africa leaving the Super Rugby, even though South Africa had a horrible record in Super Rugby. There were 2 wins, but in between, I mean, it's not as if they were incredibly successful, roughly the
Yeah.
same success rate as Aussie teams. In fact, I think over the years, Aussie teams would have registered a higher win probability against New Zealand teams than South African teams did. But there is this following. New Zealand is now following. Our forwards are not big enough. Our props are not strong enough. Why don't we have a Malcolm Marx coming through? And what I can see Razor do is say, no, we cannot go down that path. We have to become better at what it is that makes us good. And I think this is a journey for them. And I think, like everyone, they're going to have to find a team, stick to them, get a little bit of cohesion going, and see down the track where it lands. McDonald leaving, that for me is the tricky one. They still seem to be destabilized. They don't have this real target at the moment, like the Aussies do with the Lions series. So
Yeah.
maybe that allows them to have a bit of a laboratory kind of mindset and say, let's see what we can do over the next few years. But very crucially, let's go back to that fundamental principle of New Zealand rugby, which is always based around small details, a lot of small, finer technique, and essentially innovation.
Yeah.
I think
Let's
that's what I think they'll be going for.
That's fascinating. Let's talk about Australia now. So if you go on YouTube and you type in Australia rugby, the first thing that will come up is Australia rugby is doomed, Australia rugby is dying. There's tons of videos about it. And the record in the Rugby Championship speaks for itself. 1 win, and you could say it wasn't a lucky win, but you'd say that Argentina would be very disappointed to have lost that game. And then you look at the Super Rugby with the Rebels going and the record, and now the New Zealanders are blaming the Australians in Super Rugby for why they're not winning anymore. Is it really all that bad? Someone who's living in the country, is Australian rugby really this bad?
Yeah, Australian rugby, strangely enough, is incredibly healthy from a club point of view, from a participation point of view, from how, there's a really strong volunteer spirit still in the club. Rugby in Brisbane and Sydney, Perth, and is very well supported among incredibly, let's say, it's not that small a community, but when you look at this behemoth, which is league in the country, which is so well supported by all types of Murdoch media, if I can call it that, um, it's one media company that owns the sport of rugby league.
Yeah,
And they happen to be incredibly powerful well around the world. You guys will know with the Sun and the Daily Mail and all that, but also a style of journalism that's not nuanced. There's no space for really analyzing things. So rugby is elite sport. It's for rich people. The Wallabies are totally bad, and nothing's ever going to work. But as soon as you step away from that and you go and see how these clubs are run, how the leagues are run, you see a totally different story. I think that's the first point. The second point is we were lucky enough to import pretty much the whole system of what made Ireland a really strong setup. Nusafora came back. Now key part of how decisions are made long term. He's got a lot of not so enemies, but people who doubt his effectiveness in the Irish system. But one thing is for sure, he was really good at long-term planning and getting a few things aligned. As far as your provinces are concerned, as far as is getting that Super Rugby kind of tier working towards making the Wallabies strong. So we 1 year in that. We have Les Kiss returning with a bucket load of experience, I think, in the Irish system again, Ulster and then subsequently in England. And I just saw firsthand in Brisbane how he has changed completely the type of work ethic and approach to squad building, approach to how schools and clubs filter into the Reds. Within the space of a year, just remarkably different. Number one, the Reds play a hell of a lot more rugby. They now play, they even played against Wales. They're playing against Ulster now. They're playing against Tonga, Samoa. They play more games. So he identified that they're playing enough first-tier rugby, fixed that. You also have, all of a sudden, Reds under 14, 15, 16 squads being assembled with the top guys really monitoring the talent. Like Wales, like Ireland, it's a small population of rugby union players in Aussie, which is a bad thing, but actually a really good thing, because if you can monitor your talent properly, you'll find enough jewels in between them. You just then need to make sure they make it to the top and that they're well supported. But he's changed that, totally. Then you had Dan McKellar, which is a really talented coach, did well at the Brumbies. Went over to England. It didn't work out, but he's back in the system. So a lot of emotional and intellectual IP staying within the system. You had Simon Rawali, who was the coach of Fiji during the World Cup, doing really good work as a director.
He's at the Waratahs now, isn't he? Yeah.
That's right. Simon Cron came into the Force last year. Force, strangely enough, have the most money of all Australian franchises.
Someone tell them, because they suck.
Yeah, they're able to buy. I think, when you buy in talent, it's always difficult.
Yeah.
But the Perth League itself is getting stronger and stronger. A lot of expats from Ireland, a lot of expats from South Africa, a lot of expats from New Zealand, really propping up the clubs. So your club level is getting better and better. And as a result, the Force guys who go down to club level are now not, you don't have to cotton wool them in an academy sort of system like a lot of teams used to do. You can now let them play 10, 12 club games a year and know, they're going to learn the game and they're going to be all right for it. So a lot of top talent coming back into Aussie rugby is going to pay off. I can see already, I think next year, Super Rugby, the Reds are going to be very competitive. The Brumbies are always competitive. Larkham, with the experience at Munster, also growing into a mature coach, really good support around him. So is it going to always be bad at Wallaby level? I cannot see it happen. Australia has an incredibly proud sporting culture. They back it on a government level. There's a lot of money going into sport. There's a lot of drive in sports science and making all kinds of teams better. But unfortunately, it's going to be a while before the narrative turns, because the narrative, unfortunately, are controlled by a media that doesn't like the sport to exist. So
that's difficult. So I think it was interesting when I saw how many Australians are now playing in New Zealand, which is very much a reversal of what you would traditionally expect, particularly at NPC level. How important is it for Australian rugby that the Waratahs are good? They obviously finished bottom of Super Rugby this season, only 2 wins over the Crusaders, and we know that there's this historic rivalry between the Reds and New South Wales. Is that the key thing, that if there's a strong New South Wales team, obviously the last Australian team to win Super Rugby was the Waratahs, I believe. Is it important that if that team is good, the Wallabies will get better?
Yeah, I think it's so much just to do with the narrative. If any Aussie sports team does well, things turn really quickly. The media get behind you. You get bums on seat. There's just so much sport going on that the team that doesn't do well just doesn't get support, because people have loads of other things to go to. We saw that with the World Cup, Women's Football World Cup. The Matildas did really well, treated like rock stars, and people would now invest a lot of money into watching that over, say, a league team playing in Brisbane on the same night.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of variety, a lot of sport that's out there to support. And unfortunately, with that comes, if you're not winning, you talk down and you don't get support, and things will turn quickly. But the Waratahs, I think, from a point of view of Sydney schools being the strongest in the country, that we just had a series now with all the franchises playing an under 14, 15, 16 type of tournament. And, the Sydney schools really dominate. New South Wales, as a result, dominate. And that goes right up to under 20 level. Problem is then when you get into the elite professional systems, Waratahs had a lot of problems, lots of infighting, obviously a lot of politics, as is the case with all professional sport, and just couldn't get it together after Cheika left. But too much invested in it. Really strong fan base if they can get their act together. Really good for the country if the Waratahs, Brumbies, and the Reds can do well, which I don't think we're miles away from. The Force is the outlier. It's going to be interesting to see where they land. Have assembled a really good squad, really passionate support in Perth for rugby union. So I think every year we start with a bit of hope, and then a few results don't come your way, and things then die off really quickly, and people kind of wait for the next year. But you would have noticed with Joe Schmidt, and I think post Eddie Jones, and how things happen and how Dave Rennie was displaced.
Yeah.
I think there's a real understanding here now that, come on, we can't continue doing this. So Joe is getting a little bit of a leeway, and people are trying to give him some space and understand what he's trying to do. He's maybe not playing an Aussie, the type of rugby that traditionally would have been successful. I see David Campese had a big stink yesterday over shouldn't have a New Zealand coach, don't like the way they're playing. It's not Australian rugby.
He's said a couple of things lately, hasn't he, that you leave you going, who let Grandad
Yeah,
out?
from an analytics point of view, it's frustrating when these old guys, talk about a modern game which changed so much. I mean, come on.
Absolutely.
He played in an era where there wasn't even a jackler allowed. It changed the game totally.
My God.
So,
You watch some old games of rugby and you're like, what is this? Like, how did anybody ever get into this? So let's focus in on Joe Schmidt's Wallabies specifically. So leaving the things below that level for a second and talk about what we've seen. So the first thing that strikes me whenever I watch Australian rugby is points conceded. So if you look at Joe Schmidt's tenure so far, New Zealand, if I just read the number of points they conceded. So 33, 31, 67, 19, which is the outlier, 30, 33, 29 against Georgia, 28 against Wales. I'm a Wales fan, trust me, our attack sucks. And if you look at Super Rugby as well, you've got someone like the Reds or the Rebels, as was last season, finishing kind of mid-table. But if you look at the tries, the number of tries they're conceding, Australian rugby players, I haven't found one yet, but I'm pretty sure I could find you a Wallaby who has conceded at least 4 tries in every game he's played this season. So where does that come from? I've been quite harsh about it when I've spoken about it in the past, and I've said, is it in these guys' DNA to want to defend? Because all I can say from the numbers is they are conceding way, way, way too many points. What's at the root of that?
Yeah, I think, again, coming back to deep culture, you do get the sense that playing footy, you'll hear coaches talk about, we're going to play good footy. We just want to play good footy. Good footy is never involving keeping the score sheet to 0. It's just not something that at a junior level would be, there's not a huge amount of pride being put on not conceding. I think the excitement in the game here is always around the amount of points you can score. So you want to outscore your opponent, and culturally it's not something you can move away from. The problem then is if you don't score enough points, you don't outscore your opponent, things become a little bit tricky because you're always going to leak 30 points. So leaking 30 points is not a problem if you can score 50, but you'll go into the same stats now and see how rarely Aussie are able to post those big scores. And I think a huge problem in that has been traditionally that poor ruck play we talked about, not being able to get to that phase where there is a little bit of space where that natural, let's say, running line of an Australian player can come to the fore.
Yeah.
So a huge problem. But I think coming back to the defence, Laurie Fisher has been entrusted with that. I'm not entirely sure how much time he spent purely as a defence coach versus a breakdown coach. But the Brumbies do have a very different approach to defence than all other teams in Aussie. And I think there would have been a decision to say, right, if the coach is Brumbies based and we have, let's say, a fairly sizable portion of players coming from the Brumbies who understand the system, let's go with this, but it's going to take a lot of time. So they look at times ridiculously passive. It's almost as if they're disinterested. But if you hear Laurie Fisher speak and you see how some of these Brumbies teams can defend for 80 minutes against New Zealand sides and kind of sneak a win, there is a little bit of method to the madness. So again, on a first-year basis, with a lot of new players, understanding that there's been a lot of shuffling going on as far as team selection is concerned, and Joe could not do any different. He had to give a hell of a lot of players and new combinations a chance to get to look at them. And we do know without cohesion, defense is never going to really work out. But I'd love to see them just stick to it, stick to that passive method. It is at least something different. So if you're going to be playing South Africa, New Zealand, Ireland, and Wales in the same period of time, and you then play Aussie, the defense is going to react differently. And we'll talk about Japan now in a bit when it comes to attack. But I think in a world where we have access to so much analysis, the team that can do things differently has an automatic advantage. And if Australia can find a way to make this almost passive drifting defense work bloody hard at it, get really good at it, get every single Wallaby who come into the group who might be defending very differently with the Reds to come into the system, and maybe over time convince the Reds and Waratahs to blend into that mold so that everyone follows the same script, and it's not such a big shock when you come into Wallaby camp to have to defend totally differently.
Yeah.
So I think that's those two elements will be what fixes it or keeps it broken.
Yeah, and switching now to talk about the attack and exactly things that you alluded to earlier. When you look at this attack graph that I've got here, it screams Joe Schmidt. The high ruck counts that you alluded to, the high percentage of ball in the opposition half, and the incredibly low number of offloads that they are throwing, which is fascinating that you brought that up earlier. But what kind of draws my eye is high percentage ball in the opposition half, high number of rucks, but low 22 entries and low 22 conversion. That speaks to me of a team that is getting into the right areas and playing a lot of rugby, but not coming away with points. Is that a kind of, it's just going to take time to come, or if you look at the meters they make as well, it's the lowest meters of anyone in the Rugby Championship. Is that a byproduct of their game plan, or do they need to look at selections, or does Australia just not have the athletes to get over that gain line and make those gains at these tight ruck plans, do you think?
Yeah, I think to understand that we will go back to Joe Schmidt's Leinster and Ireland. To this day, even under Farrell, you see how the Irish batter and batter and batter away, then get into that 22 and are really, really accurate at eventually on phase 17 scoring.
Yeah.
It's all around precision. It's around trust. It's a skill set, staying calm. Obviously, I remember Stuart Lancaster were really big on drilling in these behaviors under pressure over time and getting it into these Leinster and Irish players to be able to do that consistently and basically play until you score. Now, in Aussie, because you're sitting with a bunch of players who never have been used to getting to phase 5, leave alone phase 12, the type of fitness, running lines, skill set, patience. There's a lot of things that are in play to convert that way. Is it absolutely necessary, knowing that the Australian specimen is a bit different to the Irish one, to play this way? I think so, but I think Joe Schmidt is smart enough once he's had enough time with this team to realize, okay, we're getting Suhali now in. He's an absolute athlete. So there's going to be more strike power out wide. We could potentially bring Karevi back, so you have that Bundy Aki a little bit more punch up the middle. You can take Skelton back, which gives you exactly that go forward in those really kind of tense situations in the opponent 22. So there could be reasons why he will persist with it, but there could be as good reasons why he might have to think of different strategies, of ways of playing that opponent 22 zone slightly differently to how he's always done it. And there, I think what's really interesting here is to see how league approaches play in the 22. They're not precious about possession. They go for the big play. So they have this really creative running line. They just really gone for it, knowing that if you don't score, it's not the end of the world. And I think rugby union is quite guilty of becoming super precious. And that's why we see these 14, 15, 16 kind of rolling drives to try and score. Now, all of a sudden, the law's changed. If you held up, the ref blows it. The refs are more than happy to blow that up. And you'll see from your stats, I think at this stage, we're close to 48% of all close quarter tries being held up and called as such. So
Wow.
we cannot forever think that that's a clever try or a clever way of scoring. All the defense has to do is just get bodies around, and the ref, to relieve
Yeah.
pressure off himself, is not even going to check it.
I don't like that rule, I'll be honest. I think that rule has backfired. I think what they
Yeah.
what they wanted to do was to encourage teams to spread wide the ball so that they could encourage so that the tries get prettier, basically.
Yeah.
Whereas what has actually happened is defenses are exactly as you say, just allowing going back to what we said right at the beginning, allowing the carrier to win the collision and carrying them over the try line, holding them up.
Yeah.
And because
Yeah.
it's a turnover, before it would have been a 5 meter scrum. So
Yeah.
it's again going into the fallacy in rugby union that scrums are bad, and it just
Yeah.
yeah. So
No, look, I'm a big believer that the scrum, in many ways, are holding the game to Ramsden at the moment, because we're trying to speed things up. And yet, at scrum time, before the law changes, from a coding point of view, you'll know yourself. As soon as there's a scrum called, there's 12 injuries. Everyone's sitting down. They're catching water. Then you have 2 resets, often a penalty after that. So my opinion was always, I love scrums, but you hardly ever see any of them. They get called penalties before there's even
yeah,
an engage. So that in itself, I wasn't too sad to see that particular scrum go. But in saying that, the laws are now that the ball can be held up. So you cannot score in close quarters, or you're going to have to find different techniques of doing, of scoring in those positions. Just you cannot have too many bodies around you. But coming back then to Aussie finding new ways, we have the advantage of a lot of our players consuming rugby league, where they are incredibly creative in that zone. That has crept over time into union, where we'll see a lot more little grubber kicks now in behind and a lot more chips and dinks. But in union, we still see them often from teams who are ahead on the scoreboard anyway, or teams who they have penalty advantage. That's when we'll see real creative play often. Whereas in league, they just do not seem to be as precious over possession in that zone. They go for the big play, they go for the big creative wham bam kind of style thing, and I think Aussie would do well to tap into that. The players see it every day. They see what happens in these big league games. They can train it. They can be better prepared for it. But it's just about not being precious.
is Joe Schmidt the wrong coach for that though?
Yeah, is he? Probably. In saying that, I don't think his involvement with New Zealand necessarily curbed their creativity,
Hmm.
but he wasn't the big chief in that setup. So it's very, very interesting for me, that question. Is he the right coach? I know he's the right coach because he's the best at fixing what's our worst element, which is rucks. But once we fix the rucks, like we seem to have done fairly quickly under him, what now? And is he going to bring someone else in at some stage and take a little bit of pressure off himself to run the entire attack? Maybe he will be really involved in coaching strike plays, but not your phase 3 or phase 4, kind of beyond that attacks. Going to be interesting to see. I'd love to see if at some stage he brings someone else on board.
Yeah. Fascinating to see what happens next. A reminder to everybody, if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, we are quite a long way in now. If you are still sticking around, you clearly like what you're seeing. So please like the video, give the channel a subscribe, give us a 5-star review down below if you're listening on the audio version. Okay, Brendon, so the next thing that I want to talk to you about is moving away from the Rugby Championship and more looking to the Pacific Nations Cup, and a former Australia coach in Eddie Jones and how he's getting on at Japan. I think we've discussed outside of this podcast fascinating what they're trying to do there, and it was a fascinating tournament to watch for many reasons. But I want to talk about what you've seen. So your company Rugbycology does work for Japan and or work in Japan and the Japanese league in particular. So can you just first talk about what Eddie Jones, from your point of view, is trying to do with this team and how that feeds into the whole Japanese rugby identity, rugby DNA as a whole?
Yeah, you can't think of Eddie in Japan now without looking back at what he tried to do in Australia just the year before. I think Joe is really lucky in the sense that Eddie ripped off that band-aid. He's one of the few people who could do that really quickly. It totally bombed in the World Cup for a lot of reasons, of which I think Eddie maybe had to do with as well. Just want to make this dog quiet. But now looking at Japan and what he's trying to do there, again, he's clearing the cupboard. He's bringing in a lot of new guys, but he's very, very ambitious as to the style that he wants Japan to play. And I think for the rest of the world, we look at Rassie, we look at how the South Africans were able to change, bringing in Tony Brown, adding a new element, picking a different type of player. Suddenly they're an exciting team to watch and study. But Japan are moving into a totally different direction. I don't measure speed. You guys measure rucks of speed, but Japan is obviously going to blow teams out of the water with that. I remember after the second Maori test, I asked Eddie, I said, look, looked very different. There's
You asked him,
something
what
here.
were you in a press conference or something?
Oh no, yeah. Obviously, after the Wallabies, we had a bit of a relationship around that
Really?
time with the
Okay.
Wallabies, and that's continuing now. But I just, statistically, you have a look at a game, and it just looks very different. And I said, look, congratulations with the win. They lost the game prior to that, the first
Hmm.
test. But I see, there's a few things here. What's going on? And he says, no, they had to sit down and realize that, again, maybe like in 2015, Japan rugby has very particular strengths and very particular weaknesses. They're going to find it incredibly hard, for example, to compete in lineouts ever. So how do you come around that? How do you find ways of playing tier one nations and really finding a bit of punch and finding a bit of success? And I think what he's trying to do now is, from an attack point of view, make them incredibly hard to defend from a fitness point of view. All the new rugby laws tend to favor that.
Mm.
So it's easy to make those calls and say, right, if we can be the fittest team in the world, if we can make everything fast, if we can have a type of an approach to a ruck that allows us to have multiple options on attack straight off the bat and not necessarily wait for a set attacking shape, you'll see. I think if you look at some of the video work done now on the Japanese team, you'll see that their attack shape is not as structured, but instead you have a lot of players just running at speed onto different lies and giving
Yep.
the number 9 a lot of options to play off. So what a time to be alive that we have these teams now. I think you would have seen over the last, say, 10 years, we've been in a stranglehold of defense. Defense coaches became so astute and everything was super structured. And the attack has been on the back burner, but I think we are about to turn the corner. That's going to come from how we approach rucks and the type of speed we play with. Make no mistake, the new tackle law has an influence on that. The speed at which scrums rather, and lineouts have to be set, the speed at which conversion kicks have to be made. The game is about to change, and I am very, very excited to see how attack coaches especially are taking up the mantle. Guys like Eddie, guys like Tony Brown are really trying to innovate in that space. And man, like I say, what a time to be alive.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind when you talk about Eddie Jones's Japan at the moment is speed. Whether it's ruck speed, just the speed of the actual passes themselves. I think their scrum half has been influential to that. Even the way that they, get around doing the scrums. You don't associate Japan with as a scrummaging team, but it's the perfect in and out, and things like even their exits, like the way that they get the ball from a kickoff and they literally a phase and then kick it, and it's happened in 2 seconds, and that it's extremely proficient. It must take a lot of repetition from Eddie to make that happen. But again, similar to what I was saying about uh, Joe Schmidt, is still conceding a lot of points as well. And we have to say that the Pacific Nations Cup, whilst we enjoyed it a lot, the level of rugby and the level of opposition that he was playing against wasn't that high. So
Yeah.
is this how far can they really go with this? It's very exciting, it's very innovative, but they came up against a Fiji team in the final, which was essentially the Drua team that finished mid-table in Super Rugby and got destroyed. And we talked about the fitness of Japan, but it really felt to me watching them that they weren't able to play this style of game for 80 minutes, and they would fall away quite badly in the second half. Is this a bit of a Hail Mary from Eddie Jones, really, in terms of this strategy that he's coming up with? Are they going to be able to take this to the level they need to in order to be competitive at tier one level?
Yeah, I think that's the main goal is how you competitive against tier one countries. So playing against Fiji will always be a tricky one for Japan. I think Fiji have over the past few years gone for length. You look at their wings, you look at their outside centers, they pick tall players. Japan traditionally just do not have that, and definitely not with Eddie's new team selection. So there's a few reasons why I think even moving forward, a Japanese team might struggle against the Fijian teams of all countries. I think the loss against Georgia was the more surprising one for me,
Hmm.
but it was earlier on in the development. Um, Make no mistake, I think Eddie has a fairly clear idea of where he wants things to go, but to build a skill set to execute that in big games could possibly take 2 to 3 years. And by the sounds of things, that's what he's aiming for. He's aiming for in 2007 to be able to slaughter some dragons again, and to get a play style. If you look at a team like Japan, they don't have to fight right now to beat South Africa and to beat England and to beat Ireland, but they want to challenge Wales, they want to challenge Scotland, they want to be able to challenge Italy definitely at all times. And I think he is building a game, let's say, philosophy and a kind of attacking style at the moment that will really, really trouble European sides. And from that point of view, I think it's smart. Try and first get up that rankings by beating, let's say, the tier B European sides. And then from there, you can challenge once you have a little bit more cohesion, once these guys have got a few caps under their belt. But I would say I'd be very surprised if Japan at this moment don't beat Wales, for example. And that despite Wales having maybe players that's been, it's still a young team, but guys who are playing maybe week in and week out a higher level rugby. I mean, Eddie has picked some guys who are basically fresh from university rugby into
Yeah.
JL1. So yes, a total rebuild, but I can see a little bit of method to the madness. But analytically, to track a team like Japan at the moment, super exciting because everything's different. And they, if for example, they can up these numbers of how many times they move ball, how many times they kick tactically, how quick their rucks are, and you correlate that with their risk level, and maybe also with a simple stat like points conceded, it's going to be fairly easy to track if this team can beat some of the big guns in a year and a half or two from now.
Yeah, fascinating. It's one of the stories of rugby at the moment. Last thing that I'd like to talk about is you mentioned Fiji earlier on, and they've won the Pacific Nations Cup. They obviously were well embedded into the World Rugby top 10 rankings now, and it feels like we're living in a bit of a golden age for Fijian rugby with the advent of the Drua, which is I still maintain one of the biggest developments in rugby this century. They've come off that incredible World Cup campaign, beating England for the first time away from home, beating Australia at a World Cup, and now retaining the Pacific Nations Cup for 2 years in a row quite easily as well. I think the thing that impressed me about Fiji was the defense. They really didn't concede many tries, although, playing against a lower level of opposition. And I loved their dual playmaker system of Muntz and Armstrong Ravula at 10 and 15. I think that really opens them up in terms of their distribution and particularly their attacking kicks. I think really stepped on a level with that setup. What do you make of Fiji at the moment, and do you think that they really are, on balance, set to be a top 10 team for a few years?
I think so, and there's three reasons: it's scrums, lineouts, and restarts. Those coachable things that again point to deep culture. So if Fiji for 3, 4, 5 decades were always sevens based, certain approach to what goes on coaching paddocks all over the island, how young players come through the system, you would create a certain athlete. Now, since we've had a succession of really good, very technical coaches involved in Fiji. We've had guys in their directives, kind of higher levels and admin levels, who understood the importance of that. So if you look at, say, a national coaching curriculum that's been handed out to all coaches, make no mistake that Fiji made a huge turn. And if you measure to this day the Drua, for example, the Drua has an incredibly secure line out, scrum, and restart. And from there, then you have two other things. You need a good kicking game and be able to manage territory, and you need good defense. Now, you can leak tries, everything like, or you can leak tackles. If you play in the right areas of the field, they're not going to cost you too many points. And you look at these Fijian teams, and they just look almost pragmatic. They long away from those razzle dazzle sevens days where England would beat Fiji by 30 points, but hell, they play such exciting rugby. I think the Fijians are way over that, and they're doing simple things incredibly well at the moment, and it keeps impressing me. And I think because the sport in Fiji is so important, they grow very fast because I think young kids pay attention, and the line out and the technical aspects around the line out is now something that is of importance. It carries currency to know those things and being really good at them. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, a Fijian player just had to be able to offload really well, be really strong, be really creative on attack. Those things are not nowadays the things that carry currency by the looks of things. So I think they will stay. The Drua being, as you say, such an important development, and they've really leapt to it. I look at Manu as well, and you see the type of coaching that's getting involved there and how seriously they take Super Rugby. Just so good for the game, eh? Really, really healthy for the game. And maybe in Europe, you guys are not maybe privy to as much Super Rugby as we are over here. But there is still a lot of innovation in that space. And you see how Fiji and how Samoa plays in these tournaments. God, I'd love to have Sunwolves back or some form of a Japanese influence.
I think that might happen. I think Super
Yeah.
Rugby is going to get a Japanese team back in just for the money, if no other reason.
It looks like I, for a while, thought there will be JL1 teams coming in, but it's going to be too hard to align the seasons. JL1
Yeah,
starts a lot earlier than Super Rugby, and for many reasons to do with weather. So having, say, two Japanese teams and one or two Argentinian teams makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense from a financial point of view, getting the Japanese teams in. But for me, just the innovation that's taking place in Japan, how the JL1 were able to attract good talent, but also make people play incredibly smart rugby. I don't know how many JL1 games you've watched this year, but how a Peter Steph the toy plays, for example, or how Sun Goliath uses Colby, or how Isaac Lucas for the Rams, the type of freedom that they have in the Japanese league to use these, say, non-Japanese players in really interesting and creative ways, make those better players, and it makes for really, really good rugby, and not frivolous. Not all scores are high in the Japanese league as it comes to the, say, the top five teams when they play each other. It's also a 20-21-19 scoreline.
mm.
So defense is taken seriously. I was very impressed by the amount of kicking and the type of kicking that takes place, by the amount of field goals, for example, that you don't even see a lot of in European rugby anymore.
Yeah, it's true.
Love it. Just so much innovation. So
Mm.
Super Rugby would it'd be very important, I think, for Super Rugby to survive, as it would be for the Premier League in England maybe to stay strong. There looks to be a little bit of issues there, and the Frenchies seem to be really just ticking on and becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point where URC might also be in a little bit of trouble. So I think there's enough disruption in world rugby at the moment, but at the same time, so much innovation happening, which only happens when there's strife, isn't it?
Yeah.
When things are hard and you have to be creative, that's when the good stuff comes out. So that's where we are, I think.
Absolutely. So, Brendon, we've talked about only about half the things that I wanted to talk about. We've reached the end of the time for the podcast, which just means that I'll have to have you on again because it's been such a fascinating conversation. There's all sorts of things about your company, Rugbycology, that I want to get into, and coding and the good and bad of the stats. But unfortunately, we just don't have time this week, so I will definitely have to speak to you
Yeah,
again.
happy, and I look forward to. And it's the interesting part of your season starting now, and then we're starting to rile up on Six Nations again. So yeah, anytime.
Yeah, absolutely love it, mate. Really appreciate it. If people have enjoyed listening or watching this podcast, if you're watching on YouTube, we do have channel membership for £1 a month. You get exclusive access to videos that you will not find anywhere else. And again, if you are if you are listening on audio formats, if you give us a 5-star review, it really helps us out. And if you share a link with a friend, that's the biggest thing that you can do to help us. There'll be links to all of the social channels in the description boxes down below. And I just hope that everybody enjoys all of the rugby that's coming up, and I hope everybody's team wins. Thanks very much, everybody.